Okay, and any new joiner who joins the meeting should see an announcement to that effect when they join us. So, good evening and welcome, and thank you very much for coming along to this evening's meeting, which we have called Get Organised Against Poverty and Isolation. My name is Danny McNamara, and I am one of two co-chairs of Green Left, which of course is the ecosocialist tendency within the Green Party of England and Wales. And can I ask everyone please to be on mute whilst anyone else is speaking. We are scheduled this evening to run for an hour and a half, 90 minutes, up to 8:30. We don't have any breaks scheduled in that time, but in the interests of accessibility, if you feel the need for a break, please feel free to take one absolutely at any time. Drop out, come back in and pick up where you rejoin us. Equally, in the interests of accessibility, please feel at liberty to have your camera off, or indeed have your camera on, but feel free to have your camera off. If you want to speak, the best thing to do, if you can, is to raise your Zoom hand. That doesn't work for everyone. As long as we have 25 or fewer, you could raise your physical hand, and with luck I should see that on the screen, assuming you have your camera off, or on rather. If we get to more than 25 participants, I will only see 25 people at any one time, and if you're on the second screen I won't see you raise your physical hand, so it may be that sometimes you have to come off mute and use your voice to attract my attention, but otherwise please, if everyone can stay on mute. So it was back in 1974. I was a schoolboy in Glasgow studying for my O-levels, and I was studying a subject which was called Modern Studies. I don't think there was a direct equivalent in England at the time, and jolly good it was too. But one of the things they used to teach as the standard course text was that in the 1970s, the UK was characterised by a corporatist system of organisation. And by that, what they meant was that power was wielded effectively, jointly, by a triumvirate of government and business and trade unions. And the system was also characterised to a very large extent by national level bargaining and by national level agreements and deals. But the official text, and you had to know this for your O-level, was that there were some downsides to this corporatist way of organising society and its economics and politics. And one of the downsides was that this tended to neglect those who were not represented either by trade unions or by businesses. In other words, people such as pensioners and people with disabilities were marginalised and often neglected and did not benefit from those national level deals that were being cut otherwise. And I only mention this to remind us that this question of the underrepresentation and indeed the underinvolvement of marginalised communities and marginalised groups is very far from being something new. It's something that has been as for a long time. But recently, of course, it has become a much bigger and more important issue. And hot off the press, this really is hot off the press, just this morning, the government published its scheduled update on workforce statistics. And one of the items buried in there that the government is not drawing attention to is that in the UK, we now have in excess of 2.5 million people who are not working and for whom the not working is attributable to long-term sickness. In excess of 2.5 million long-term sick and unable to participate in employment. That is a new record level in this country. Now, if you think about that in the context of the way that the level of benefits have been cut back, in the context of the way in which the way that benefit schemes are administered and the eligibility criteria have been manipulated to choke off access and to choke off entitlement, you begin to realise something like the size and the scale of the problem. So I think it's important for us at the outset of this to recognise the scale of the problem. Now, there are ways in which people who are not in employment, for example, can achieve a degree of recognition. I have just come literally 2 minutes ago, or 2 minutes before this meeting, from a meeting of Unite Community, which is part of the Unite the Union, that provides membership for people such as myself who are retired, or others who for one reason or another have no workplace income. And frequently that might be because they have caring responsibilities, or because they have a disability, or one reason or another. And that's all well and good, but actually what membership of organisations like that often offers is the opportunity to participate in campaigns around the benefits for others who are in employment. So we can go and join picket lines and we can campaign and all the rest of it. But seldom do we find ourselves in a position where we have any muscle that we can exercise. We have no labour to withdraw. So what muscle can we exercise? But of course, as eco-socialists, and I think most of us in this room would call ourselves eco-socialist, we recognise that there can be no climate justice without social justice, and social justice can't be partial, it can't be selective. In order to be justice, it has to be universal, otherwise it's not justice at all. So some of the questions that we are concerned with are: how do we ensure that people who currently are marginalised or excluded are properly involved, properly represented whenever we are addressing big social and political challenges as eco-socialists? So to discuss perhaps these questions and other questions prompted by the title, prompted by the theme of this evening, we've got three special guests. And the format of the evening will be that each guest has up to 10 minutes, let us say, to talk. And once everyone has had an opportunity to speak, we will then open it up for questions and indeed perhaps for more general discussions. But we'll start initially with questions. And if I just briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll go to the first speaker once I've done that, taking them in the order in which I propose that they will speak. First of all, we shall hear from Beccy Sawbridge. Now, Beccy is co-chair, jointly with myself, of Green Left. Beccy is also the Equal Opportunities Officer of Green Left. And then we shall hear from Joseph Healy, and Joseph was alluding just a little bit earlier to a time when he used to be a member of the Green Party, and I remember him leading some workshops in a basement under Reading Town Hall a number of years ago when he was a member of the Green Party. Joseph is active now with anti-capitalist resistance and has experience previously as a benefits advisor, so clearly relevant knowledge and expertise there. And then finally we shall hear from Dzaier. Dzaier is the Green Party's current Equality and Diversity Coordinator on the Executive Committee of the party, is also chair of the Green Party Disability Group and a member of Greens of Colour. So those are our speakers, each up to 10 minutes, thereabouts. You know, if someone runs over by a minute or two, we're not going to get too upset about that. But as a general guideline, and then we shall open up for questions and discussion. So without any further introduction from me, I'm going to mute myself and invite Beccy to address us for 10 minutes. Beccy, over to you.
Thank you, Danny. I thought in terms of what I wanted to speak about today, I've changed my mind 101 times over the last week. But it is important to understand at this moment in time, in which I wish to speak about on a very personal level, I would say, is that the problems that we have, as Danny alluded to in the introduction, Danny and I are of similar ages, and I did local studies in the late 70s, which was you know, a CSE subject. That these problems remain with us. It's just the mechanics of how our country, our government system, our organizations are that have changed in that time. I wanted to speak first of all to say that one of the things that has brought people who may well have considered themselves to be marginalized, and particularly people in part-time work at this time, is the level of strike action that is going on. And the thing that brought me into sharp focus, the understanding of how global capitalism works and how it affects all our lives, was because I was involved in the 1988-89 strike when I was a seafarer. That, more than anything, was really, really difficult, because it meant that as a working person, a full-time working person, who then came on strike, and particularly after the loss of the Herald of Free Enterprise, which happened in 1987, we in 1988-89 were both grieving the loss of our shipmates, but also incredibly angry with our own trade union and how they were using us as a bargaining tool against Thatcher's government. And that work, sorry, I speak with my hands more than anything else, that work that happened at that time was particularly troubling, but also gave me a huge insight of how difficult it was as a woman of color, as a female seafarer more than anything else. I was then, through the strike process of over a year and a half, brought into sharp focus with other trade unionists, and realizing how both misogynistic it was, and still is, I would say, in terms of organizing, but how if you are part of the community that they don't recognize, it becomes much harder for your authentic voice to come forward. And it was also a blessing. After the strike, I was blacklisted. I then became a student because I couldn't find work. More than anything else. And I became a member of the Black Students Campaign. And through the work of that, I saw that process yet again, how people who live on the edges of what other people's expectations of what you are become marginalized, and how your voice then becomes less authentic, but is even more important. While I was on strike, while I was a member of the National Union of Students, and as a member of a national committee member for Black Students Campaign, we produced this leaflet, this poster rather. And I just wanted to read you just the first paragraph of it, because it was important, and how it worked. I apologize now because I'm going to use two swear words, but little italics on here, but I will just read it. It says, because, it was called Because, and it goes on forever, but, oh, well, not forever, but goes on for a while. It says, because all Black people are niggers, and if we're not, we're packies, or half-castes, or mongrels, excluded from school as children, and undermarked in college as students, then unemployed as graduates, although everyone knows that we do have a job. If we do have a job, it's to fill quotas, and if we don't, we're state scroungers, and because we're the first to be sacked and the last to be promoted, and because we're underrepresented in Parliament and overrepresented in prisons and psychiatric wards, and if we complain, we're militants playing the race card, and if we don't, it's our slave mentality, and if we demand equality, we really need special treatment. If we wear traditional clothes or have beards, we're backwards. If we're not, and if we wear a headscarf, we're oppressed. Just that little introduction to this poster, which was produced in around 2003, and which I had a hand in as being a committee member for Black Students Campaign, resonates with me still today, but it resonates with so many people whose voices are stifled and boxed by the way that we live in this society. And the other thing that I thought to say today is about how technology is still being used as almost like a golden penny that will solve our problems. But actually what technology is doing now, and particularly AI, is it's redefining the stories that we have so that the authentic stories are no longer used. And this is something that we, as eco-socialists, need to be very aware of. On Sunday, Laura Koonsberg's program highlighted a fellow. I need to say his name, which I wrote down. Emmett Mostak, and he's the leader of Stability AI, and he was talking about concepts and big data and understanding concepts. And one of the things that he mentioned over and over again is that he referred to stories, that we can tell better stories, that AI will help us to make better stories. But what I would argue is that these stories become less real if they don't have the authentic understanding of the people that belong to those stories. And that's why I thought I'd offer at the beginning this understanding of being a striker for some time, but also being a student, and how that marginalization continues. So now, like Danny, I'm a member of Unite Community. I'm an equalities officer, and I support other people. I think that's all I need to say, and the others can have more time if they need.
Thank you very much indeed, Beccy, and a very worthwhile set of very personal reflections on the process whereby, as you say, one's authentic voice, the voice of the lived experience of an individual or a community, can be strangled really by overlapping expectations of norms that themselves are socially generated. Very powerful story, and thank you very much indeed for that. So we shall move on next to our next speaker, who is Joseph Healy. And once again, Joseph, what I shall do is I shall put myself on mute. Sorry, can I just ask once again that everyone else on the call puts themselves on mute if they can, so that those sort of coughs and shuffles and what have you don't get in the way of us concentrating on the speaker. I shall put myself on mute, and Joseph, over to you.
Thank you, Danny, and I'm very pleased to be invited here tonight. I'm actually one of the founding members of Green Left. It must have been about 18 years ago now when we drew up what was known as the Head Corn Declaration. in the village of Headcorn in Kent, and that's the sort of constitution of Green Left, really. I mean, Beccy was talking about stories, so I'm going to sort of tell my story, really, which has been some of the things that I've been involved in and witnessed over the last few years. But I'd like to say I know a number of people on this call. I know I chaired a hustings in Lambeth a couple of years ago where Dzaier was standing for election to the council for the Green Party, and I know Thelma quite well, and Thelma and I are involved in another political project, which Thelma might want to say something about later, I'm not sure. But anyway, I'm a member of Anti-Capitalist Resistance, which was a group established just a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, which describes itself as a group of revolutionary socialists. It's not a political party. Most of the people in there are probably in the Labour Party. Some are not in any party, and then there's a group of people, including Alan, who's here on this call, and myself, who are in another party called Left Unity. So it's quite open to anybody to join, really, and it has an agenda for, you know, radical social and economic change. So how I met Dzaier, for example, is that I worked for nearly 14 years in a disability charity, small disability charity in Lambeth, called Disability Advice Service Lambeth. And I wasn't actually dealing with benefits. I was dealing with a thing called direct payments, which is where disabled and older people are given a budget by the local authority to employ people as their carer, you know, personal assistants, they're called. But lots of people know them as care workers. And I found over the course of that period, you know, beginning early on, the care packages that were available to people were reasonably okay. And you'd have things like people would be funded to go on art courses, and people, you know, the care packages themselves were fairly generous. But as time went on, especially after 2010, and as austerity began to bite, the care packages became more and more and more limited. So much so that, you know, a lot of disabled people will tell you that basically now it's you know, feed and eat, basically, and they're the most basic packages, so that you can be somebody with a disability living in one of these boroughs like Lambeth could be getting maybe a visit for half an hour from a care worker, you know, which is barely enough time to do anything. And the other side of the coin, of course, is that the charges, social care is not free like the NHS. So the charging system has become more and more pernicious and very, very difficult for many people to pay. So one of the most awful aspects of my job was having to tell people that their care charges had been reassessed, had gone up. And I would have people on the line, you know, literally crying, saying, what am I meant to do? I can't pay my gas bill. How can I pay for my care? And I would just have to tell them, well, you know, there's nothing whatever I can do. This is what the local authority has assessed you as. And I know that there were many people who gave up on direct payments. And, you know, what happened to those people? I heard various anecdotes from friends of theirs that, you know, sometimes they were really in a terrible way. I mean, virtually abandoned in their homes without any support system whatsoever. And this is the cruelty and real horror of, you know, the poverty which many people face. And I have to be honest and say, I left Dazzle last summer, actually. But I have to say, probably for the preceding 3 years, my morale was absolutely rock bottom, because having to hear these stories firsthand from people, and knowing the terrible situation they were in and being unable to do anything about it, you know, as a worker, was absolutely terrible and very soul destroying, and, you know, made me very, very aware of the reality of poverty, deprivation, and exclusion. And it included a lot of older people, but also many younger people with disabilities, and struggling families and so on. One of the other things that I encountered there was that the care workers, the personal assistants who work for many of these people, are paid a paltry wage. So at least in Lambeth and some of the most of the Labour boroughs, there is the London living wage, which I think at the moment is about £11.80. But when you compare that with a care worker who has quite a level of responsibility, and somebody working in Tesco's can probably earn more, with, you know, nothing like the same level of responsibility, it became more and more difficult to recruit people to these posts. And that was another thing that we found very frustrating over the last few years, was the fact that, you know, to find people willing to work in the care sector was virtually impossible. And I think that that has made the system, in my opinion, virtually inoperable. Even agencies now are unable to recruit staff. So, you know, there's a gigantic gap in the care market. I think there's 150,000 vacancies or something like that. It's, you know, it's far, far worse than the NHS, and the NHS itself is in a chronic state. After I was working at Dazzle, because I'd been a union activist and because I'd been, first of all, the equalities rep there for a number of years, and later on the shop steward, I was offered a position with Unite at the regional headquarters as a regional officer. And that was a 6-month, you know, short-term contract. And it was dealing with people working in the charity sector. So I was working in the field, which, you know, I had been working in for nearly 18 years. And that was another reality check, because I found myself working with organizations like the Citizens Advice Bureaus, which are in an absolutely chronic situation. Many of them are, you know, virtually bankrupt. They're totally dependent on funding from local authorities. Local authorities are not putting in any uplift into the contract. So they sign, for example, a 3-year contract, and then inflation comes up to 10%. And the end result is that the staff working in those organizations, who already are, you know, having to deal with the fallout of the debt crisis and the poverty and so on, those staff who are, you know, worked to the bone, we couldn't, even in the best of circumstances, get them anything better than a pay rise of 2%, maybe 3%. They couldn't literally go on strike. Well, they could go on strike, but we would know that the employer was not in a position where they had any funds. So as a union officer working with the reps, you would have to, you know, say to the reps, well, what are you going to actually achieve here? Because if you've seen the books and you've seen the state of their finances, you know that no matter what you do, because if the local authority is not actually backing up, you know, filling the gap, those staff in many of those small charities are in a terrible situation. And it's a vicious circle, because then they find they can't recruit new staff, very high rates of turnover and so on. And the other group of charities that I had to deal with in my role as a union officer was the care side of things. So you'd have like care organizations, some of them quite big, some of them with quite a lot of funds, like Jewish Care, for example, but paying absolutely appalling rates of pay to care workers. And again, care workers, you know, with huge levels of responsibility, very long hours, burnout and so on. And we found the same situation in that sector, you know, rapid turnover of staff, low morale, and many of these organizations, you know, unwilling to pay. Now, the union's position was that certainly in our London and Eastern region, the basic pay for any care worker should be £15 an hour. And that was our basic demand. But you look at the pay that most care workers are getting at the moment, I mean, it's way, way, way beyond that. So, you know, there's a vicious circle here involving people with disabilities, older people, their care needs, the care workers, and the whole social care system, which is really, you know, in complete meltdown, really. So, you know, all of the things I've been doing, I mean, I have to say that as a union, Unite, and I know a number of you are in Unite community, which I think is a brilliant initiative. We did have strike ballots in some charities, and we did achieve pay rises and so on in some charities, but particularly the smaller charities, which are dependent on local government funding, That's where the problem lies. And I kept making the point to the union that we needed to put pressure, Unite needed to put pressure on local authorities, particularly Labour authorities, to actually, you know, increase the pay and increase the funding for those smaller organizations, because those organizations, what's happening in effect is the local authorities are outsourcing these responsibilities to smaller charities, and then the charities are not in a position to pay their staff a proper wage. So that's something that really needs to be urgently addressed. I was at a conference in Vienna a few years ago, and there was a political scientist there who had done a lot of study into voting patterns. And we know that the precariat, as they're known, people with, you know, precarious jobs, and many people who have, you know, no guaranteed income and so on, is a growing phenomenon all across Europe, but particularly in the UK. And political studies show that those groups are particularly open to voting for left-wing parties, are particularly open to voting for change. And I think, you know, there's a big future there. And I think one of the ways that the unions, for example, fell down was that some years ago, many of these care workers I spoke about earlier, particularly who work for individual employers, there was no attempt to unionize them. So many of those workers are atomized. They don't have a support network. They don't have any mechanism of actually getting better pay and so on. And I think it's an area where the unions have only very recently woken up to, you know, the opportunities that there are there. My time is probably up, is it, Danny?
Yes, I mean, if you've got, you know, perhaps another minute, say.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to say that Anti-Capitalist Resistance has a very active disability group, for example, one of whose members I am, and they've recently put together a very, very good policy document on accessibility to all meetings in terms of, you know, terminology, papers, not just physical accessibility to buildings and so on. And that work continues, and they are also looking at, you know, various campaigns around disability issues and so on. I think, you know, as you mentioned, 2.5 million people are currently outside the labour market, and that's going to, in my opinion, increase dramatically for two reasons. One is long COVID, which, you know, is going to be significant illness. And the second reason is that the NHS is effectively collapsing. And because people are having to wait such a long time for treatment or not receiving treatments at all, you know, that number is going to dramatically increase, and that will have big economic and social implications, I think.
Thank you very much indeed, Joseph, and a lot in there, a lot indeed. But perhaps for me, the biggest takeaway is that stark reminder of the enormous crisis in social care, and the fact that, you know, it impacts not just those who, as it were, consume the services, those who receive the services, but the workers who provide it. And it's, you know, we can blame the local authorities, but we know that they too have experienced funding cutbacks since 2010, equivalent to 60–70% of their funding. I mean, all of this goes back to Osborne's austerity, I think. That was the root of it. It's the Conservatives and their approach to the priorities behind their public expenditure patterns. But the levels of suffering are cranking up and up and up, and the footprint of it is getting wider and wider. And as you say, it becomes unsustainable. So our final speaker is Dzaier. And Dzaier, in a second, I shall put myself on mute and then over to you. So over to Dzaier.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm just going to give you a quick zoom through my life, really, in terms of where I am today. So I was adopted to a British family who were very left wing. So I was brought up, you know, being on all the master marches at the age of 4, visiting people who had been arrested because of their views on ban the bomb. I then kind of progressed to school, through school, set up a students' union, or schools students' union. My parents, my father was a Labour councillor. He also had a disability because we were both spinally injured. This is my adopted father, and he was chair of education in Brentford. So, and then I was very political in work. I worked for Lambeth as a social worker, in all areas of social work. And then I was a shop steward in Lambeth in social services, and had a ridiculous situation once where, because I was competing at an international competition, because I was also a Paralympic athlete, we were on strike in social services, but actually because I had to go to a competition, I was the last person in social services to go back to work, because I was still on strike when everybody else was back at work, because I was at a competition, and like a week and a half later I had to present to work, and kept my fingers crossed that I still had a job. And then I worked for many years as a social worker in the London Borough of Lambeth, covering all aspects, but finally in child protection. And then I retired in 2020. I worked for a voluntary organisation that dealt with direct payments. So I was what was called a direct payment coordinator, and we had finances from several local authorities. And then how I got involved in the Green Party. So I had been very involved in Labour, but they changed their their policies, and I just couldn't any longer stay. Had I stayed with the Labour Party, I most probably would have been an MP now, but I just couldn't go with the changes in terms of moralistically. For me, they were totally wrong. So I'd like to pick up on, and then I spent many years at Paralympic level, travelling. I was working part-time because my pension allowed me to do so. And then the organisation, voluntary organisation, collapsed. So then fortunately I got some work as a part-time support worker on direct payments, where I was employed and paid through direct payments. And then actually another quirky story is how I joined the Green Party was in 2018, I think it was, local elections. On the election day, I was bored and I felt I wanted to get back into politics. So I contacted all the local parties, well, Labour and Lib Dems and Greens. And the only people that ever got back to me was the Green Party. And so I actually met Joseph on the polling station, because I said I'd come along and just help for the Greens, because they contacted me, because I'd done this before and I'd been involved in elections, running local elections with the Labour Party. And so that's kind of how I joined the Green Party. I thought, well, I want to get back in politics. There really is nowhere else for me to go at the moment. And so that's how I, got involved in the Green Party. And yeah, many of you will have heard my voice over the years in terms of raising the issues of disability, of race, equalities. So I'd like to actually pick up on a few things. So let's be clear that the austerity in terms of disability was actually started by Blair. And a good book for many of you to read is by Ellen Clifford, who's part of DPAC, which is the Disabled People Against Cuts. And she did a chronology of how we've arrived at where we are today. And Blair was the person that decided that disabled people had, for some strange reason, had too much power. And so that was the beginnings of the attack. And then the Tories took that on with a vengeance. And of course, many of you have heard how disabled benefits have been cut, how disabled people have been, you know, in the benefit system, we're liars, we're scroungers, we're everything that's negative. The other thing about isolation is, if you're not in work, you're actually quite isolated, because my life, you know, I had a really good social life because of my work colleagues. I also had, you know, things to do because of my politics and my union and others. So that was another side of you know, having an interesting life. And then there was my sport. Well, you know, I gave up Paralympic sport in 2016. But, you know, I've aged, things have moved on. And now, you know, the only thing really that I'm connected with is the Green Party in terms of stuff there. Yeah, COVID has affected lots of people, but actually what the government did there was they were very clever in they frightened people, senior people and disabled people, into removing themselves from society. So shield. And there's still people who are afraid of COVID. And of course we should be afraid of COVID, but actually we should not be removing ourselves from society. So that was one thing I spent the whole of my life saying, I'm here, I'm a voice. And so I chose not to shield. I didn't shield, and I did everything that I could do, you know, going to the park with my dog and, you know, going shopping because that was a day out, you know, because that was a way of meeting other people. And some of you will know that I also look outside of the box and realize that actually you could meet people under lockdown, but you had to be clever about how you did it. And I'm not talking about having people in your home or stuff, but there were ways of doing it. And so I did that. And actually lockdown for me was quite exciting, because you met people that you wouldn't normally meet, you know, doing things in the community that you wouldn't normally do. But now we're in a situation where many disabled people have been by society, and sadly I would say the same in the Green Party, because they're a reflection of society, have isolated disabled people. And we don't have the voice anymore, because what happened was disabled organisations that were very, very strong got into contracts with local authorities. And so what happened was they were tied up in not being able to do the other work that they were doing, which was being a voice of disabled members in their communities. And that's why they died. That's why the disabled voice has died, because there aren't the organisations anymore. And I think we also have to, I personally would challenge some of the stuff in terms of, yes, direct payments is a rubbish amount of money. But the local authorities decided that they're quite happy to pay quite large hourly rates to private organisations, and many of them are actually big corporations. They're spin-offs, all groups, but actually belong to a much wider corporation. That's in residential care and also what many people know as home care. And this is something we've got to stop, because what's happening is that local authorities are happy to pay 25, 30, 40 pounds per hour. But they're also happy for the workforce to be paid a minuscule amount of money of that. Now, I know this because there has been occasion, and trust me, I was forced psychologically to use an agency for to cover while one of my own carers, who I employ myself, had to go on leave. To my horror, I was being charged £30 an hour. But when I was talking to the people that were coming to me, they were only getting £10 an hour. So I actually contacted the organisation and said, could you let me know what are you doing with that further £20 an hour? Because I actually want to know what it is, that's where this money is going. I was in a very fortunate position that I only had to do it for a short period of time. I also would like to raise the issue in terms of disability, that as many disabled people are getting a really poor third-rate service from the health service, from local authorities, because what's happening with disabled people is once these organisations realise that you're disabled, what they do is they offer you telephone appointments. And so actually you're not getting the service that you should be getting. And health is appalling on this, is that you can be demanding face-to-face, but every time you get offered an appointment, it's always a telephone appointment. Now, I'm very strong-willed and determined, and I go, well, that's not what I want. So one of the things I think, in looking at how we move forward on this, is, and that's something that we need to really look at within the party, is how do we incorporate disabled people within our organisation? Well, one of them is, when you do come across disabled people, actually make them welcome in your meetings, etc., etc. Make sure that your meetings are hybrid, so that people who can't or struggle to get out and about can actually participate through the internet. Other things that people could do is just actually, what I used to do and people used to do many years ago when I was in the Labour Party, you just thought you didn't have to be asked, people just did it. Offer people lifts to get to the meeting if they physically can't get there. Befriend people, and that's how you get people involved. And not only will it enrich your life or the party's life, it will actually make life less isolating for people, disabled people, senior people, people whose life who have maybe through their circumstances become debilitated and things aren't so easy. So for me, that's really what I wanted to say tonight, is that it is difficult to maintain links, and especially like in the union, because I was a very strong union person, but it's been really difficult for me to maintain that, which over the past period of time, recently with all the strikes and things, I actually get to learn about things too late. And one of the reasons is because I have to plan. If I want to be out somewhere and in the early morning or 10 o'clock, I actually need to plan how I'm going to do that, because I have to do medical procedures in the morning. So I actually have to plan in advance. I have to know, okay, I need to get myself sorted, etc., etc., and with my workers by such and such a time to be able to actually be there on time. And so I think people, need to bear in mind that somebody like myself, getting up in the morning is a 2-hour job, 3-hour job. It's not I get up, I hop out of bed, I hop into the bath or shower, get dressed, shove something down my throat, and I'm out the door. And again, I think we have to be really mindful that for many people, and I am talking about, remember the statistics of disabled people, and it's growing because of COVID. 20 to 25% of the population in this country have a disability or long-term health condition. And that's something that we really, as a party and as a society, need to understand. We are not a small percentage of society. We are a big percentage. And if we can get people to actually campaign, fight, like they did in the 80s, we can make massive, massive change. Because today, the reason people who have buggies could use buses is because of people like me who fought and, trained ourselves the buses to make sure that buses became accessible. So when you see disabled people fighting to get to use the bus spaces, remember who enabled the guardians of children with buggies. It was us. And many of the things that have changed is because we fought for them. But we're not going to give them up. And we need people to support us, ensuring that we are not pushed out of society. So yeah, that's all I've got to say. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much indeed, Dzaier. And I think an interesting point there about disabled people perhaps losing a voice is the organisations that previously represented them kind of die away or become hostage to local authorities who maintain the contracts under which they receive most of their income. And of course, as you said, allied to this is this idea that local authority budgets for social care, for example, are not optimally used because they're often used on outsourced contracts to private commercial organisations who are profit-taking, who try to minimise costs while maximising revenue. And in the few local authorities where services are brought back in-house, we tend to see a big uplift in performance. So that's public money, taxpayers' money, that really it's a mirror image of the National Health Service. As soon as you start paying private organisations to deliver service, you get less, not more value for money, despite what the Conservatives tell you. So thank you very much for that. We've now heard from all three speakers, and I'm about to open it for questions, but Pete, who's hosting this, did draw my attention to Valerie Smart, who had a hand up towards the end of Dzaier's remarks. So Valerie, I'll just come back to you for a moment if there was something that you'd wanted to say before I open it up to questions from the floor.
Sorry, I was just wanting to make that sadly, I work for the health service, not that sadly, but sadly, the only appointments that tend to get offered nowadays, and it's not just to disabled people, are telephone appointments, which is an absolute travesty. But yes, just making the point that actually it's not just disabled people that are getting telephone appointments. I appreciate that was the lady's, sorry, I forgot her name, the lady's experience, but yeah, it seems to be everybody's, and it doesn't seem to be lifting any time soon.
Yes, well, of course, Rishi has said that he'll soon provide us with 6,000 additional GPs, and that will solve the problem of access to GP appointments. And if you believe that, then I'm sure there are lots of other things that you can believe. However, now, well, thank you for that, Valerie. And I'm now going to open it up to questions, and perhaps if we take the questions in groups of, well, let's start with 2 and see how that works. And the first hand that I see is from a person whose Zoom username is Fire Tablet. So clearly that's not the person. So, sorry, Becky? You're on mute, Becky. Was it Keith Hampton?
Yeah, I think it might be more. It's Keith. Yeah, sorry about
Keith,
that.
yes.
I've actually put my name in there, but I don't know why it's not come out properly. It's me and technology. So that's what I'm a retired member. That's probably why. Just a quick question to Beccy, if I may then. So I've worked with Beccy for quite some time, and she really is a community activist, and should applaud her. She just got elected again to the town council. So through her hard work for the Green Party, she's now on the town council fighting against some very strong independents, Conservatives, and now, unfortunately, Labour people who are trying to keep her down. But, you know, we'll keep that fight going. I mean, what's concerning me is all these things are going on out there, but we need to raise the bar in some way. And I wonder how Beccy feels the bar can be raised, because she's already doing far more than many around her in the Dover district where we are. So how can we raise the bar? Because some people still don't believe that message that we're putting out there. So how do we make them believe it?
Thank you for that, Keith. Keith, what I'm going to do is try to make sure that the questions are addressed to all three. But I think the question you ask is a fair one for all three, because all three, I think, are committed activists who are giving their all in this struggle. And you're saying, you know, how can we raise the bar? So I think that question is as applicable to Joseph and to Dzaier and to Beccy, and with all three will have something to say about that. So I'll take a second question from Roy. And Keith, if you could pop your hand down so that I don't get confused in the next round of questions. Roy, please. What I do is I'll take that first question from Keith, and we'll go to Beccy, and then Joseph and Dzaier, and after that we'll mix it up a bit. So how do we raise the bar? So Keith was saying we're putting in lots of effort in, but there's a great deal more to be done, and clearly the situation is in many ways getting worse, not better. So how can we, you know, use our energies better and more in order to achieve more?
In all honesty, and I'm sorry to be a doom monger, I don't think there is a lot more that we can do. But in my introduction, I spoke about how the changing face of AI is happening. One of the things that has recently come about is that bots answer emails now for big companies, and this changes the perspective of people's work, and that we must be mindful that the sands are always shifting, and the honest thing to do is to carry on doing what we have been doing all this time, but get more people to support us in that. So I'm thinking too about the words of Maya Angelou, where she talks about rainbows and clouds, that we must be the rainbows, the light that supports those around us, and that will raise the bar for us. But it is going to be a really hard slog, because it's about telling stories, telling our stories, and having an authentic voice.
Thank you, Beccy. And I think maybe the best way to summarise that is to say it's all about building a bigger movement, building a mass movement. And just whilst you're on the topic of AI, sorry, can everyone else go on mute, please, because we're getting some sound interference.
Rather than, we've already heard how brilliant our staff are here.
Okay. Sorry, that was a little sound clip from somewhere else. I'm going to abuse my position as chair slightly to digress just for a second on AI. I would strongly recommend everyone to go online to last week's Guardian and look for an article on AI by Naomi Klein, in which she takes one by one all of the myths that are being peddled by the proponents of AI, how it's going to lead to more rational decision taking, how it's going to help with social justice, how it's going to help with the fight against climate change, how it's basically going to dissolve all of our problems. And she systematically dismantles each and every one of those. She says, for example, if you look at climate change, building a larger and more sophisticated database isn't actually addressing the problem, because the problem is not that decision makers currently do not have access to sufficient information. The problem is that they have all this information, but they are still being guided in their policy choices by other motivations which have nothing to do with saving the planet. So it's not an information problem, and AI ostensibly solves information problems. This is a very human problem. But the thing she says, well, does anyone know of a superior species? And if AI becomes a superior species, does anyone know of any example previously in history of a superior species which is controlled in the long term by an inferior species? And the answer, of course, is no. So that's a very short digression, for which apologies, but I would recommend it should be compulsory reading for every adult, I think. So raising the bar, Joseph.
Well, following on from that discussion about AI, I don't want to make it an apocalyptic evening, but some of the points that Dzaier raised earlier about COVID are very relevant here. So one of the other campaigns I'm involved in is COVID Action, which is trying still to put in place mitigations to protect people and, to make, to bring in clean air and things like that. And one of the most depressing aspects for me of the pandemics has been the mainstreaming of eugenics. And, the death rate amongst disabled people and the way in which, there are many people I know at the moment who cannot receive vaccines, for example, who are still completely excluded from, mainstream society and from having a normal social life and so on. And there's been no effort to accommodate those people. I mean, both in terms of meetings, in terms of public transport and many other things. And I see this mainstreaming of eugenics. And I would have said before that one of the ways to raise the bar was to tell people stories and to actually, give illustrations of how things impact on people's lives. But now I'm not so sure, because I think the public has been desensitized. I mean, there are still 600 people a week dying. There are many, we talked earlier about the number of people who are long-term ill and growing. And the people have been desensitized. And I think that is a step towards fascism. And that is one of my major concerns, that we are moving rapidly. I mean, Neil Faulkner, who was a historian, who was one of the founder members of Anti-Capitalist Resistance, wrote a book a few years ago called Creeping Fascism, which at the time many people criticized as being, too pessimistic. But in fact, I'd say we now have galloping fascism, because combined with the public order bill and the attempt to stamp out and repress, any protest and many of the things that people would have done traditionally. And we now, as you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we now have the anti-strikes bill, which is an attempt to crush the union movement as well. We are, it's a perfect storm now, and showing all the characteristics of an authoritarian fascist state. And I think that's what we're up against. And that is very, very challenging. I mean, I'm still thinking that, some organizations like DPAC and others have achieved a lot through direct action, through protest and so on. But how feasible is that going to be going forward? I would say that electorally, of course, we still should be electing as many progressive people as we can to local authorities. It's interesting that Rees-Mogg has let the cat out of the bag this week and revealed that they were deliberately gerrymandering the voting process, but it backfired on them, according to him. But, this again is an indication of the way that they're trying to clamp down on all forms of protest. So I think, we're in a very dangerous situation at the moment, and I think we need to wake up and smell the coffee and make the general public a lot more aware of what's really going on.
Indeed. And, I think as further evidence of that process of desensitization, permitting a culture of nascent fascism to grow, you only have to think about recent remarks by cabinet ministers suggesting that all grooming gangs are made up exclusively of Pakistani men, or suggesting that migrants do not share our values and therefore ought properly to be deported to Rwanda. I mean, these statements 10 years ago would have caused outrage, and now they attract a very brief press comment for perhaps one 24-hour news cycle, and then they're gone by the next 24 hours. Things have become normalised, which ought to be standout unacceptable, and it's difficult to describe the shock that one feels when confronted by the way these things have become normalised. So for the final response on the first question, which is about raising the bar and doing more in this fight, we shall go to Dzaier, and then we'll come back to Roy's question, which is now in the chat. So, and for the next question, I'll go Joseph, Beccy, Dzaier in that order. But Dzaier now on the raising the bar question, please.
Okay, raising the bar. I think we've got to do things differently. And I think we've got to start getting people locally to be involved in things, whether that's holding, an ad hoc meeting at the local market or farmers market, or, having a stall. So we're talking to a large number of people, and then getting those people to, come together, become I don't know what you call it, a cell or something, and from small, as they say, from one acorn, a large tree can be grown. And I think the issues that we really need to be raising with people and talking about and seeing how we can make change. One is racism. And in some areas, it may not be something that people would want to talk about. I certainly know in the inner cities that would be something that people want to talk about, how the police are criminalizing, and adultizing children, how the police are being allowed into schools. I think we also have to recognize that some direct action for some people would not be possible. So as a disabled person, I'm quite happy to, go to demonstrations, etc., etc. But, my wonderful position that I had many years ago, which was I knew that I wouldn't get arrested in demonstrations. Those days have gone. I have personally seen 7 police officers lift somebody in an electric wheelchair who is on a portable oxygen machine into the back of a van, arrest them and take them off. So, because of course, we did a good job in saying we need everything accessible. And what they've done is that they've made accessible cells. They've made parts of prisons now accessible. So you are getting an increased number of people being arrested. And also myself as a person of colour, Black person, it's more difficult for us to do very much direct action, because actually the implications are massive, absolutely massive. Getting arrested, you get into the court systems, and that has an impact on, your future employment or existing employment. So there are groups of people, because of this legislation, that the government have very cleverly, pushed out. But I think there are ways that we can do it. And it may be that you have to, when you're doing some real direct action, there are always people who are willing to take, that sort of position. We've seen that in XR, and so maybe we need to be smart there. I think really, in terms of the things that we've talked about, in raising the bar, we actually have to raise the issues, because a lot of people, I don't think, actually believe what we're saying and what people are saying. I really don't. I really think a lot of belief, because it's not happening to them. They don't believe that it's, that this is, so many people are affected. And certainly, I'm sorry, Valerie, but I'm going to have to dispute that with you. And it's not for debate. I'm just saying I'm going to dispute what's going on in the health service and disabled people. It's not up for debate. But again, that there is a kind of there is, as was through COVID, there were people who had no knowledge that a do not resuscitate had been put on their records. And, you know, and I still think there are people who absolutely have no knowledge that this was done behind their backs. And I would agree with you, Joseph, that this government is going for a eugenics. We also have to be very, very careful about AI, because one of the things that is being talked about, certainly around care, is, well, people don't need to have as many hours because we can design robots to do things. AI. We, you know, people can have all of this technology so that things can be done for them. Electric things can, you know, be done for them. I mean, there's a huge knock-on effect at the moment in terms of the energy crisis, because, of course, you have to have money to be able to use your electricity to enable the AI stuff to come in. But actually, it's a form of cuts, because you don't have to pay. You know, there's no cost in terms of once the robot's been built. There's no further costs apart from the cost that you pay, which is charging it up. And so again, and if you also look, we're having these virtual wards that I personally think, and time will tell, they are going to be absolutely disastrous. And I think it's another way that this government and the health service, and I do blame NHS England, you know, I absolutely blame NHS England. They have allowed and through the trust, they have allowed all these hospitals to close down. And so therefore areas have only one hospital where they had 3 before. We had a choice to fight it, and the trust chose not to fight it. Now that could be because the chair people of the trust were planted by the Tories, because a lot of them are political appointees. But you know, we had a chance, we didn't do it. We now actually have to fight for it and to try and retain and get stuff back. So for me, is the fight is getting stuff back. Many of the stuff we had in the past, in the last 20 years, is not something that we should have got rid of. And actually, maybe we do need to step backwards. Maybe our society, in some ways, in terms of employment, I never thought in my lifetime that there would be 0 hours contracts. And yet, if you look at the huge numbers of people in a very, very short space of time are now on 0-hour contracts, we have to fight these things, because nobody can survive if they don't know what money's coming in this week, next week, or the week after, or next month. You can't survive because you can't plan for it. So I think that's how we raise in some of the ways that we raise the bar.
Thank you, Dzaier. So we've got about 12 minutes left remaining of this meeting. So for the next question, I'm going to ask respondents to limit their replies to 2 minutes only, please. And we'll go in the order which I had suggested, which is Joseph, Beccy, and then Dzaier. So we'll go to Joseph first with the next question, which is in the chat from Roy. And in essence, the question says, we've recognised the fact that there is an attack being launched or being sustained against benefits claimants, not just by the Tories, but historically by Labour and Lib Dems also. What do we do in order to organise people to fight those attacks on benefit claimants? We'll go to Joseph, please, first for 2 minutes.
Well, I think it has to be a twin-pronged approach. First of all, via things like direct action. I think we have to do protest a bit more imaginatively. I mean, large-scale set protests marching from A to B are a bit, a lot of people feel they've done a lot of these I mean, a lot of the anti-war demos come to mind. I think I took part in 17 anti-war demos after 2003, and they were all very similar, marching from A to B in central London. I think we have to do things like target job centres and, you know, other places associated with the system, and people who enable that system to come about, like MPs, offices, and so on. I know that's somewhat controversial in the view of some things that have happened to MPs in the past, but I think, you know, if you are in public office, you have to be prepared to face a certain amount of protest from people in your constituency and so on. And then, of course, you know, the other part of that strategy is putting up candidates for election who are progressive candidates who are going to actually talk about this. I mean, this is where I become party political. I mean, the Labour Party is utterly failed and is moving, you know, at a rate of knots to becoming some sort of right-wing party, which is very close, you know, to the Conservatives. The other part of the prong, as I've said, is, you know, the combination of direct action, targeting particular places associated with the system, and also, you know, promoting candidates and putting questions to candidates who are standing, particularly for local government. And I mean, to be somewhat controversial here, this is where I fell out with the Green Party in 2012, as Pete will know, when, you know, having stood on a programme of refusing to implement austerity, the first Green Council in Brighton went ahead with an austerity programme the following year. And I know that Pete was a part of, you know, the Green Left delegation, which went down there to try and argue the case. I would argue with the rise of Corbyn, for example, 2 years later, if the Greens had at that time raised the standard of being the party that was prepared to stand up, you know, for the people at the bottom of the heap and was prepared to challenge austerity, then we would have been in a very different position today. But fortunately, you know, old-fashioned thinking and inability to see outside the box was an aspect of that.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Beccy, next, please.
I think one of the things that we have to do is to learn to be a bit more awkward. One of the things that people that know me here in Dover will understand that nobody quite knows what I'm going to do next. Yeah. So when it comes to dealing with benefits, because I've been on benefits for quite some time, dealing with political parties, I am quite happy to tell them, you know, like, I am dyslexic, I have mental health issues, I have physical health issues. I still write my prescription and pop it in my doctor's letterbox, and two days later I get my prescription. Being awkward is something that we need to do, and that then harnesses the space for making those arguments for progressive change. And it's something that we have lost. We have lost our voices for, because it is so incredibly tiring, and that's why we need more people to be with us and to support us. My friend Keith gave the question earlier on, and I am so pleased that during this election campaign I had him standing next to me most of the time and dragging me around the streets, so that while I was talking to the world and his wife, and the world and his wife plus their cats and dogs, he was the one who was putting things in the letterbox. So it's about looking after each other and working as a group rather than as individuals.
Thank you, Beccy. And finally, 2 minutes, please, Dzaier.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So the question is, the attacks are being sustained on benefits claimants by lots of the grey parties. What can we do to fight back? How can we organise people to fight back?
Yeah, I think we have to we have to give the stories in terms of, one, getting people to understand that all of us and are possibly one paycheck, one pension check away from being in that situation ourselves. We've become a very selfish society, and so the only way I think people understand messages is if you can actually make it so that they see it themselves, to do with themselves, in terms of how it's going to affect them. And so I think that's one way of doing it. I think also, yeah, I mean, we need to be trying to get, communicating with people that are in that situation, and actually helping them, people who are more fortunate, helping them to actually fight as well. And I understand the difficulties in that, because people are very fearful in terms of, if they say or do something wrong, that they will lose their money. And that's exactly the way the DWP are acting. I think in terms of benefits, I think we should have, really national or organised pickets on what's happening in terms of DWP offices. I think we should be bombarding the private organisations that the DWP are outsourcing to, and actually, showing just how disgraceful they are, and the amount of money that they're making out of it. Because trust me, they are making huge amounts of money in actually cutting people's benefits. And we should be also raising with our MPs, we need to be getting them to speak in the House actually where the money's going. We do not need to cut people's benefits. We do not need to make the benefits as low as they are. The reason this is happening is because the government has a will for that, and that we actually need to change that. And we need to say, so that everybody understands, that their taxes are going into the hands of big corporations like Capita, and soon some American organizations, that's where our money is going. And actually where that money should be going is to increase people's benefits. We also have to raise the issue that we've lost the state's net, because that seems, the catch net seems to have gone. And again, the only other thing is that we have to show the Tories and the Lib Dems, because as far as I'm concerned, they're just as bad. We have to show them for what they are. And I just give one thing to any Green Party member. We also need to be raising this in the party. We need to actually challenge the fact that the party seems to want to only have Tory voters. And that's where they seem to think. And the other thing is, in terms of social care, we have the best social care policy of any political party in this country. And what we need to be forcing is that we are discussing the issues of social care on the doorstep. Because what all of the political parties are saying, including the Green Party, when we go on the doorstep, nobody talks about social care. So I've asked.
We need to start winding up very shortly.
Yeah, I'm going to. Okay. When I've asked the question, but do we talk to people about it on the doorstep? Their response has been, oh no, but when we do, oh my God, we can't get away from the doorstep. So, we can make changes. And as Joseph said, we have to be what we believe we are, which is a socialist party, and be proud of it and fight for it.
Thank you very much, Dzaier. I'm aware we're at time, but Muttley has been very patiently waiting with a hand up, so I'm going to go to Muttley von Erich.
I'll ask for permission first. Can I just add a short answer to what the other three have said, specifically to the question just raised?
Yeah, can you keep it to 1 minute? A very
Yeah,
short
okay.
answer. Yeah.
I'll keep it short and sweet. I was speaking to the Daily Mirror today about exactly this with the cost of living payments. They're going to be publishing something in the next couple of days because it's being debated in Parliament, the petition. So contacting things like that is something else we can do. I can direct people on the right thing. There's also stories regarding the DWP screwing people over. I might be doing something with them with that. So if anyone wants to come on board with that, that's another thing, is going to the media. Thank you.
Fantastic, Muttley, and of course you're absolutely 100% correct. The media have a huge role to play there, and I hope you see the reply in the chat from Joseph, who said that he will contact you directly by email about anti-capitalist resistance and potentially, I guess, left unity also. So we are now at 8:31. Just sort of 1 minute over time. I'm aware that there might be people who have got absolutely burning down issues that they need to raise, and I'll give anyone who needs to do that 1 minute to do so. That's to say, anyone who hasn't spoken yet. Doesn't look as if there are any. So what I'm going to do now is just, on behalf of us all, say a very sincere thank you to Beccy and to Joseph and to Dzaier for taking the time to come and speak to us this evening, to all of you for coming along and making this a vibrant and successful meeting. We are Green Left. We are the eco-socialist tendency within the Green Party of England and Wales. You can find our contact details on the internet quite easily, and potentially someone might be able to put an email address in the chat in the next 30 seconds where you can contact us if you're interested in joining. Once again, and especially also to our colleagues and comrades from Anti-Capitalist Resistance, Left Unity and elsewhere who have joined us this evening, much appreciated, and we're grateful for the solidarity. Once again, finally, thank you all very much indeed, and we look forward to seeing you once again at our next speaker meeting, which will